This is Mr. Beck Does Your Homework. This is the introduction to homework 2.4 for AP Physics. This homework deals with free fall. And to discuss free fall, there are a couple tricks that you need to know. The first thing you need to know is that if you are standing here and you throw a rock straight up, or any object straight up, at the top of its path, when it goes up and hits that very maximum height before it turns around, at that top of the path, you have to know that it's going to momentarily, very momentarily, hit a velocity of 0. So at the tippy top of the path, I know that the velocity equals 0. That's good to know. The second thing you need to know is that if I'm on level ground, when I go up and come back down, when I get to this point, I'm going to have some velocity in the downward direction. So if this were my initial velocity, the velocity here will be opposite that initial velocity. So if this is initial velocity up, say this was 12 meters per second, when it went up and came back down, it would have a negative velocity of negative 12 meters per second. So that's a trick you can use when it goes up and comes back down, that the speed in this direction, it will be the same as the speed in this direction, but the direction will be opposite. So the magnitude is the same, but in an opposite direction when you throw it up and comes back down. The third thing is that the amount of time it takes to go up and down, the amount of time up is going to equal the amount of time down. So time up is going to equal time down, which means it reaches its maximum height at half the time. So that's going to be half the time, assuming that it's on level ground. So if it goes up and back down to the same position. The last thing you might not want to know, the last thing you might want to know is that if it goes up and comes back down, once it gets to this spot, the displacement is going to be 0 once it's gone up and back down again, because it's back where it started. If it's up and back down again. So that's a fourth trick. So you've got the velocity is 0 up at the top is a first trick. The second velocity is that the initial velocity and the final velocity are going to be opposite each other. The third trick is that the amount of time it takes to go up is equal to the amount of time it takes to go down, so half the time at the top. And your fourth trick is that if it goes up and back down, then the displacement is going to be 0. And you can use those to solve your problems using your equations of motion. Now, I have rewritten the equations of motion, so instead of x, my x position equals my half of my initial velocity plus my final velocity times time, I'm going to start putting things in terms of y. So if x is left and right, then y is up and down. So I can write that y, my y position, my vertical position, is going to be 1/2 of my initial velocity plus my final velocity times my time. So I'm going to start using y's instead of x's. Even though your equation sheet says x's, I'm going to use y's. My second equation says my initial velocity equals, my final velocity equals my final velocity equals my initial velocity plus my acceleration times time. Well, if I'm dealing in the y direction, I know that my acceleration in free fall is just gravity. So I can say instead that my final velocity is my initial velocity plus the acceleration of gravity times time. So I'm going to substitute g for a, because I know g is negative 9.8 on UTexas, negative 9.81. My third equation says that my position is my initial velocity times time plus 1/2 my acceleration times time squared. Well, in the y world, if I'm talking about vertically, I can change my x to a y and say that my vertical position is going to be my initial velocity times time plus 1/2 of my acceleration of gravity, g, times time squared. And using the same logic, my fourth equation that says v squared equals v0 squared plus 2ax. Well, this equation, if I plug in g for a and y for x to turn it into an up and down equation, I will see that my final velocity squared is my initial velocity squared plus twice my acceleration of gravity times my height, y, my vertical. So these are the equations that we're going to be using, y versions instead of x versions, along with these tricks in this homework. And before we leave this, I just noticed that this needs a squared just to be equivalent, and that's the right equation, not what I had before.